Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Launchpad's Pick and Mix podcast. And wow, we've got a professor with us today. So if you're watching on video, you might recognise the face. If not, then we have the great Toby Greany here to talk to us today, who is a professor of education at the Nottingham University. And yeah, we're going to talk a bit more about kind of your life, how you got to this position, some ignition points, and obviously now we'll pick some launch pads as normal. But I guess one of the things that people might instantly be thinking is Professor of Education. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? What does a Professor of Education do?
Good, yes, good question. And not, we do different things.
Right.
So I'm, for example, for the last few years, I haven't been teaching, a lot of professors, it's a mix of teaching and research.
Okay.
Because I've had quite a lot of research work on, I haven't been teaching these last few years, although I am actually supervising some master's dissertations this year, which is good to be back doing again.
Yeah, nice.
Usually you're teaching on a master's, at least one master's program or undergraduate. Yeah. We don't have a lot of undergraduates in our School of Education, so it's mostly masters in leadership program. And obviously supervising PhD and EdD,
of course,
and then research. And the other category that we have is called service, which is kind of everything from sitting on, groups and committees. And, I'm part of a curriculum review group within the School of Education here at the moment. That would be an example of service. So kind of things that help the university that are otherwise just kind of good things to do.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I haven't heard of that before. Does the service element extend outside the university?
Yeah, because certainly at Nottingham, we're big on our kind of civic contribution. So it might be that you sit on a governing body or a trust board, would be an example of service. I was a trustee for 8 years. And that was an example of service.
Oh, I love that. Oh, there we go then. Well, I've definitely learned something already. I was telling my son this morning, because people who listened to this before will know this, but he's not particularly impressed with me being a doctor, because he says I'm just a paper doctor, not a real doctor. He's only 11. But for some reason, he's fascinated by professors. So when I told him I was talking to a professor today, he was really impressed. So you are.
It's funny because when you're abroad, of course, professors are not just teachers, but they're not professors in the way that we understand them here. So it's funny how it's different everywhere you go.
Yeah, and I guess you don't have to worry about being on a plane. People don't say, "Is there a professor on board?" like they would be with the doctor.
I can relax and enjoy that easy jet flight.
Well, people that we'll go into a bit more detail later, but people who aren't familiar, one of the big things that you're passionate about, I guess, are issues relating to kind of school leadership and educational system reform, those sorts of things. I know you sit on lots of boards and you've advised lots of governments and lots of overseas stuff. And some of the books, to kind of reference, I suppose there is that sort of one on kind of leading educational networks, which I think will be really fascinating for listeners. And I know lots of them are part of, or if not leading, kind of communities of practice and stuff like that around their schools. And one thing we'll talk about right at the end is your current project, which sounds fascinating. It's a 3-year project, is it, on sustainable school leadership?
Yes. Yeah. And that's going to be my second ignition. So I'll talk about it then as well.
We can go into that a bit more. Yeah. Well, let's get started then. And for those that are new to the podcast, we have a kind of set structure with some sort of different elements that come in. And the first one is what we call a fast friends question. It's like kind of a question that gets to, get behind the leader and hopefully collects a bit of connection. And so you chose for your first one, Toby, if you could wake up tomorrow having gained any one quality or ability, what would it be? So what was that?
So it would be able to play the guitar at a really high level, which I would deeply love to be able to do. I have got a guitar here behind me in my study. Okay. And I have tried to learn it on occasion, but I've just never found the time to give it.
No.
And it's one of those things where when you're not good at it, it's just frustrating. And so you've got to kind of break through that pain barrier to get to a point where you can bear listening to yourself. And I've never got that far. My daughter's boyfriend is with us this week and he is a musician. And so, literally today I've been going downstairs to make a cup of tea and he's there playing the guitar in the living
Oh
room.
no!
I wish I could do that.
Yeah, rubbing it in. Well, already that's fascinating, isn't it? Around that idea of, and we've talked offline about my passion for self-efficacy, and of course, there's a strong link between low self-efficacy and low resilience to challenge. You know, for people, for students, for staff, if you've got a perceived lack of confidence in something, you do struggle to push past those kind of barriers. And I wonder if there is a threshold that you have to get past with the guitar that then fuels future practice. Interesting. Have you put
Certainly,
it on?
I notice about myself that, you know, if I'm, this isn't true in everything, but lots of things like the guitar, you know, if I'm not good at it reasonably quickly, I
Yeah.
get frustrated and I give up. My wife is very good at kind of craft and design type things.
Okay.
And she'll just decide, right, I'm going to learn. You know, taught herself to knit. She taught
Right.
to sew, to weave. She'll just start a new hobby almost every year and
Right.
get through that barrier in a
Yeah.
way that I know I would find if I wasn't good enough at it reasonably quickly. I'd think, oh, I can't do this. Never mind.
Have you put it on your retirement list
It
or?
is on my retirement list.
Yeah. I've pushed Spanish onto my retirement list because I've tried to learn that about 25 times. Amazing. Okay, well, let's keep moving on this. Talk about your first ignition point. And so, again, for those that are new, these are events or kind of moments in the guest's life that has made a difference to them and served as a bit of an ignition point. And the first one you chose was called the Learning to Learn Project. Tell us about that.
So back in the 90s, when was this? About 96, 97, I had been teaching abroad for 4 years and I had come back, done a master's. And to be honest, the master's was in adult education for kind of international development. And I was imagining I was going to go back abroad. But I thought I'll just go back to London for a year to kind of catch up with family. Got a job with a charity called Campaign for Learning, which at that time was a project of the RSA, the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, which is a kind of very venerable organisation in London. And it was a project which was trying to encourage people to engage in lifelong learning. And so I was there for a couple of years and we were doing all sorts of interesting things, not doing a lot of work with schools, if I'm honest. It was about adult learning and lifelong learning and kind of, post-compulsory. But we had a new boss arrive, Professor, who's now Professor Bill Lucas. He wasn't Professor Bill Lucas in those days. He was just Bill Lucas. And he had a background in schools. He'd been a deputy head. He'd run an education charity working with schools. And so he introduced this idea that we would work with a group of volunteer schools using action research to understand learning to learn, metacognition. Essentially, if you help children to understand how they learn, and the question behind it was partly, do they learn better in the classroom and in schools, but ultimately, do they become lifelong? Are they more likely to become lifelong learners because they've kind of a better understanding of themselves as learners? So we did an initial 2 years working with 24 schools, some really fantastic schools all across England. Then that was great. It was all a bit kind of, we were making it up as we were going along.
Of course.
And so then I got the funding and kind of tried to do it a bit more properly. So I then kicked off a 3-year phase with a much bigger, kind of more representative sample of schools. We had about 60 schools in 3 localities. And we commissioned, I don't think he was professor. He certainly, he wasn't professor in those days, but Steve Higgins, who was then at Newcastle with his team there, Kate Wall and others, to evaluate and to kind of help with the action learning, the action research aspect of it, and to ensure that we were drawing out the learning from that. So that ignited, my interest in research, my interest in working with schools, my interest in professional learning, my interest in kind of evidence-informed practice. All of that really started with the Learning to Learn project.
I love that. Did the success in that one lead to confidence to then go into, because I guess you didn't have your doctorate at that point, did you?
No, it definitely built my confidence. I mean, kind of spending 3 years traveling on long train journeys with Steve down to
Yeah.
Cornwall. Once a term we'd go down to Cornwall, or we'd go, I can't remember the other localities now, but we had some long train journeys together, and that
Yeah.
just seeing him work and how he talked about research and evidence and all of that definitely kind of got me going in a way
Yeah.
that has
I
sustained.
mean, we joked offline about the fact that me being who I am and getting a doctorate might have spurred on some of my colleagues who were perceptually more intelligent than me to then go and do something. Did you have a moment where you held Steve in this high esteem and then you actually felt like, oh, we're not so different after all? Maybe I could do that. Is that an experience?
Um, Steve is somebody who's just incredibly humble, I guess I would
Right.
say. I feel probably embarrassed that I didn't recognize his expertise enough. I didn't hold him in high enough esteem, because I remember we met on a train station. I was kind of going around the country interviewing different universities with a view to who we would kind of commission to be the
Yeah.
evaluators. They weren't evaluators, but to be the research partners. And I met Steve on a train station. We had a cup of tea somewhere in, either Newcastle or somewhere around there. And so we just got on from day one, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And it was a complementary set of skills. I mean, at
Right.
that point, I was probably more interested in policy
Right.
and kind of how we kind of use the research to influence and inform policy. And
Sure.
Steve was leading on the research side, and that meant we were a good team.
Yeah. Interesting. So just thinking about leaders who, may be reluctant to get into academic research or that because of a perceived lack of experience or aptitude. And I guess, yeah, for those of, I don't want to include myself, but I suppose for those of us who have got these qualifications, being a bit humble is probably an important thing in terms of creating an atmosphere where people do feel like they can, yeah, do the same thing. Oh, that's great. Well, let's get stuck into the first kind of launch pad. As again, new people don't know, but each guest chooses two launch paths from the Leadership Launch Paths book. And we basically just kind of, I'll talk through what I was thinking when I first made it, and then we'll ask you why it resonated with you. And so let me just share the screen and we will get cracking on that. Do, do, do. So this first one, once the computer catches up, is called, there's Toby there, the deliberate differentiation of leadership development, which I know you've got a lot of experience in. And what I was thinking when I first thought of this was kind of, I wonder whether leadership CPD curriculums in schools or in any other settings should more closely reflect the level specific requirements of the participants. So rather than trying to be kind of everything to everybody, maybe there should be some sort of differentiation, for want of a better word. And so I started off thinking, okay, well, what would the levels be? And of course, broadly, I suppose, I mean, we in schools know we've got kind of middle leaders and senior leaders, and now we're more familiar with this idea of executive leadership. And I thought I'd add another one below middle leadership just in case there was one. So I started off with the kind of levels of leadership, and then I started using, and again, we talked about this gentleman before this, some of the David Pendleton stuff around, okay, well, how could I break up potentially a leadership curriculum? And so I chose, the primary colours kind of categories of strategic leadership, interpersonal leadership, and operational leadership. And then just kind of unpack those in my head. This idea that strategic leadership is things like vision setting, utilizing research, data analysis, kind of culture development, and then interpersonal kind of leadership would be the normal things of like building, sustaining relationships, trust, managing conflict, recognizing and rewarding, building capacity. And then, of course, you then go down to the operational and talk about things like kind of resource management, monitoring and performance, implementing change. And, different people will argue whether those things fit in those categories. But for me, it was an interesting and useful kind of gateway into it. But the real thinking I wanted to do was, wow, I wonder if different levels of leadership development need to have different almost proportions or percentages of those things. And so I started off thinking, well, I suppose as I've gone through my leadership development journey, I've had to become increasingly strategic And as I've gained a team and I've been able to delegate, I've probably done a lot of less operational stuff. And then in the interpersonal, I thought, well, it don't become any more or less important, really. It's probably important at all levels. And so I came up with this idea, yeah, that potentially when we think about building middle leadership courses, maybe should we have more operational than strategic? And as we go higher up, maybe the balance changes. But why did this resonate with you?
So first to say, I think the Launchpad's book and the just how you've synthesized lots of kind of complex ideas is really helpful. I liked this one. I picked this one. It reminded me of, so for 7 years, 2006 to kind of 2013 or so, I was Director of Research and Policy at the National College for School Leadership, as was. Mm-hmm. And when I first started there in 2006, we commissioned a kind of review of the evidence on leadership development. And one of the things that I took from that review was a similar kind of framework to what you've got here. Although the point they were making was slightly different in that they were saying, in your earlier years as a middle leader, you have less experience to draw on.
Right.
And there's more need for you to kind of, there's more content that you need to kind of understand about what leadership is, what management is, kind of, how to understand these issues. Whereas as you become more experienced, then the amount of content reduces and it's more about reflecting on your experience and helping senior experienced leaders to kind of draw out the wisdom from their experience. Yeah. And I always thought that was a really helpful framework. So, over those years, I was very much involved in kind of the design and then the redesign of the national professional qualifications. At that point, we didn't have quite the same framework, but we kind of evolved that during my time there. And we used that rule of thumb. So our programs that were for more experienced head teachers, for example, we really tried to keep the content as light as possible.
Yeah.
It ups the ante in terms of you need really good facilitation. And of course, you still need lots of good collaborative opportunities for people to reflect on experience as middle leaders. I'm not saying that it becomes irrelevant there.
No.
I think, that kind of rule of thumb of kind of how you think about content is helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that, but I suppose that makes a lot of sense. It's not dissimilar to some of the mistakes I made when I was leading teacher training, 10 years ago, where, you throw fresh trainees into lessons, don't you? And then you go, so what do you think? And they don't have a foundation of knowledge to be able to reflect very deeply. Oh, that's interesting. So not just about the content of leadership development programs, but also the modes of delivery. Oh God, that is interesting. Great. Wow. So the next thing we're going to talk about is another fast friends question, which I'm really interested in. The one you chose here, it says, what is your most treasured memory? Tell us about that.
I'm going to interpret that to allow memories.
Okay, good. Yeah.
And it's family holidays. So we've got 3 kids. They're now quite grown up, 23, 22 and 17. Right. They still come on holiday with us, actually. We've just come back from 2 weeks in France, which has been gorgeous, but all of those holidays, just really golden memories of windy beaches in Scotland quite a lot of the time. And we haven't done anything particularly fancy, but they're just really golden.
Yeah. When do you think there'll be a last one? What age?
We endlessly fret about this. When will the day come? And can our holidays have gradually got a bit more exciting because we kind of we can't take 23-year-old to a windy beach in Scotland, which is why we adventured as far as France. But we'll have to keep making them a bit more exciting.
That is funny. Like someone was talking to me the other day about children growing up, and we'd have to try and find some tenuous link to leadership here, I suppose. But it's frustrating when you don't know it's the last one. Like when you don't know it's your last year at a school, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's your last, whatever it's going to be. And I suppose that points to really being in the moment and trying to savor every moment and, soak it all up.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, this is the bit I've been really looking forward to because I've engaged with this a little bit online through the questionnaire that you sent around. But I'd love to hear more about what you alluded to as your second ignition point, this kind of sustainable school leadership project. So tell us about that.
So yes, coming to the end of this 3-year study. It And the reason I've chosen it as an ignition, I mean, I've done lots of research projects over the years, and I've always really enjoyed doing research, and all of them I could have chosen as igniting something.
Of course.
This one has been of a different order for me.
Right.
It's the biggest project I've led, just under £1 million. It's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which kind of is probably the most prestigious kind of funder. So
Yeah.
it kind of gives you a level of confidence that this is really important research, and it's just been amazingly kind of fascinating and fun in equal measure.
Right.
What we've done is we're looking at school leadership across the UK, focusing particularly on England, Scotland, Northern Ireland.
Okay.
We planned a lighter touch review in Wales. I could talk about that if you're interested, but focusing on those three mainly. I've done some comparative work before, but never at this kind of scale and depth. And that, the extent to which there's both huge commonalities about leadership across those three nations, the challenges people are facing, the things that sustain people, working with, people across all three nations in that survey that thank you for completing that. What sustains people, it's very similar in all three, all different roles,
Right.
all different types of school. It's children watching, helping children grow, seeing children grow, spending time with children and colleagues, and kind of, having good colleagues, other things that sustain people. And that's true across all three. Equally, if you look at in the other, the other side of that coin that we asked about in the survey was what drains you as a leader. And you see, although there are some commonalities, there's also these really interesting contextual differences,
Okay.
Behaviour is a bigger issue in Scotland than it is in England.
Right.
Operational issues are a bigger issue than in Northern Ireland than they are in England. Equally, if you look at, we split the sample in England between in primary. We can't do this at secondary because there's not enough local authority maintained schools at secondary now. But at primary, you can split the sample between academies and local authority maintained.
Okay.
And in the qualitative research in England, we've done 7 locality case studies. So in each locality, we visit about 12 schools, mix of primary, secondary, reasonably representative kind of spread in terms of contexts and so on.
Yeah.
And we interview system leaders, local system leaders, so kind of chief execs of multi-academy trusts, HR directors in trusts, people in the local authority, whoever, people who know about that locality and leadership in that locality. So we have this kind of really rich picture of leadership in these 7 different localities. And when you split the survey sample between primary and between academy and maintained, it's interesting because the HR directors and the chief execs say, well, we're making leadership sustainable by running the back office. We're doing the finances, we're doing the HR, we're doing, the estates, and therefore we're freeing our head teachers up to be able to focus on teaching and learning.
Yeah.
When you look at the survey, that's not true at all.
Really?
Anything actually, local authority leaders are spending more time on teaching and learning than leaders in trusts. It's not. We haven't looked at the statistical significance of this yet. It's probably not significant, but nevertheless, to a small extent. More to the point, they're spending less time on teaching and learning than they are on admin and what we call care, which is a combination of kind of behaviour, inclusion, SEND, well-being, often other things, to support children, food banks, buying a mattress for the child that doesn't have one at home because they can't learn if they've had a night's sleep. So this kind of really interesting differences between the three nations, similarities between the three nations, and the way in which it seems, having spent 20 years or so researching school leadership, I think we are seeing that it's really changing post-pandemic, in the world that we're in a way that I think the national policy frameworks, the national standards, the national professional qualifications, and so on,
Yeah.
don't yet fully recognise.
That's interesting. Yeah. And of course, I guess that, so the project is about almost personal sustainment rather than an organizational. So, how do you sustain yourself as a leader rather than sustain a school improvement or something like that?
There's elements of both, if I'm honest. I mean, we're looking a lot at two research questions. The first is kind of just how does each nation recruit, train, and support school leaders? So it's the kind of systems and the effectiveness of the systems at succession planning,
Yeah.
leadership development, and so on. And the core question within that, do we have enough leaders? Do people want to become leaders? The second question is a broader question about kind of, is this sustainable? Is it fit for purpose? What do we think about things like equity, diversity? If we acknowledge that, society is changing and children's lives are changing, what kinds of leadership do we need for the future?
Yeah. I don't suppose, was there any split among around the level of leadership? I know you've got maintained and maintained.
Yeah. I mean, so picking on the survey, but in the interviews, we've also interviewed potential leaders as well as heads. I mean, our focus is on headship, but we've interviewed potential heads as well as heads and system leaders. In the survey, for example, is really interesting. We ask a set of questions about kind of school culture, school, how much agency do people have? Those kind of questions. How much do we use research? How much do we involve people in decision making? And essentially, what you see all the way through is that the heads and the exec heads have a much rosier view than the other senior leaders and middle leaders about those issues.
That's interesting itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, linking back to our idea of leadership development at different levels, I wonder if whether we would need to differentiate the support that we give to leaders at different levels in order to sustain them. That's interesting.
I definitely think we do.
Yeah.
And at its simplest, you would hope that where you've got good support for heads, they're then supporting colleagues within school.
Yeah.
And I think that, that can work really well.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of challenges around the current models of support for heads, which look different in all three systems.
I was just talking to, again, a mutual colleague of ours, Alison Fletcher, my boss, today, about us purposely putting in some kind of short-term coaching for anybody new to role in leadership or new to the trust, because we talk about that kind of self-efficacy dip almost. There's a natural dip in there whenever you take on a new role or move context, and that you're going to get an understandable dip in your confidence. That's interesting. So we're going to try and do that. Right, well, let's keep cracking on then, because I'm really keen to talk about this next one, because as I said before, you have got some real expertise in subject communities and school-based networks that we'd like to unpick. And so the second kind of ignition, sort of launch pad that you chose was this one, which says kind of collaboration is not just nice, it's necessary. And over time, I've, spoke to colleagues and been in situations where people go, oh yeah, it would be nice, wouldn't it, to group? And I think, well, yeah, it should be something that you think is the cherry on the top. It kind of should be core business. And certainly as trusts came about, that's probably what the initial idea was. And certainly in my trust, we just basically see ourselves, collaboration is everything that we do. And so when I was thinking about this in terms of the launchpad, I just basically started thinking about kind of this idea that, seeking out opportunities to work with others shouldn't be this sort of cherry or an afterthought. It should just be the way that we do things. And I then started thinking about some of the benefits, and I guess this is just a small splattering of the benefits. But for me personally, the first one's been perspective. I'm kind of never not surprised by what I learn by meeting with people and talking to people who think differently to me. And I think probably earlier in my career, I would have seen that as a negative thing, maybe, or something to avoid. But actually now I kind of seek out people who've got additional viewpoints because I know that potentially they'll add a little bit of an extra nuance to what I understand. So I started off with perspective, and then I thought kind of, efficiency, which I suppose is what you were leaning towards in the research, this idea that a lot of people think that by taking away some of the mental load or even physical load from a leader, you then free them up. And I suppose there is probably a sweet spot with that. To go slightly off piste, I wonder, and I've got a slight worry about going too far with efficiency in that you then take away the responsibility through which people learn. Like when we talk about teachers, this idea of, oh, don't worry, you don't have to plan your lessons anymore because we've created them all for you so that we can be more efficient. And that kind of misguided idea that no, it's the process of planning which is the important thing, not the actual product. So that's something that I have to keep telling myself because I love efficiency, not to kind of go so far that you rob people of the gold. Expertise, I think, is similar to perspective, really. But as I've got older, I've definitely lent into my weaknesses. I thought when I was younger I had to be everything to everybody and be this whole super rounded leader. And now I've kind of, luckily, I suppose, got into teams where there are other people who have a weakness where I have a strength, and they have a strength where I have a weakness. And so I now, definitely seek out people with extra expertise. I guess the perspective stuff leads to potentially innovation. This idea that new stuff comes from the confluence of different ideas. I then started thinking about engagement. I know that I've definitely the collaboration that I've been doing online for maybe, I don't know, 10 years on and off through social media has just supercharged my engagement and my kind of fire for everything. And I think it means, for me, it's about being exposed to people with an energy that is then almost like infectious. You kind of get to. I'm going. I don't, this will come out in a month or two, but on Saturday I'm going up to the Research Ed National Conference, and that is always just a kind of gasoline on the fire because you're suddenly surrounded by people who are just full of fire and energy, and I always come back super engaged. And the last one I thought about is decision making, in that collaborating with people during decision making processes not only, I guess, potentially exposes you to different perspectives, but it allows you to, I guess, put on show your thinking and potentially uncover biases and misconceptions and all those sorts of things. So that's what I was thinking when I first thought about this. But why did this resonate with you?
You mentioned the book on leading educational networks, and this area is a long-standing interest of mine. I find it really fascinating. There's so many things I could talk for a long time about this. So one thing to say, Cabot Learning Federation, where you work, starting with David Carter's work, which I think was quite influenced by kind of David Hargreaves and on that idea of joint practice development that he kind of pushed as the heart of the self-improving system idea. Cabot is a really impressive example of this. I happen to know, because I know Alison and yourself, but also Helen, your former boss, Helen Angel, is currently undertaking a PhD with me at Nottingham, and is looking at this whole idea of kind of what she's calling teacher epistemic networks.
Right.
Communities of practice, drawing on Wenger's work, communities of practice, as well as other things, to kind of try and understand so many of these points that you're making about kind of how it can help to build people's, teachers' expertise, their confidence, their engagement, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think one of the points I'd make about all of that is that, doing it productively that sometimes people talk about collaboration.
Right.
Not all collaboration is productive. It can be done badly. And so
Yeah.
I think there's a really important kind of question about what does the leadership of successful collaboration look like?
Yeah.
How do we orchestrate this? How do we really make sure it is productive? And within that, I'm not assuming, I think your point about efficiency is absolutely right. So in the book, the Leading Educational Networks book, I wrote it with a colleague in New Zealand, Annalise Camp. And we use these 4 theoretical lenses to I wrote a case study about England. She wrote a case study about a group of schools in New Zealand. And then we analyze these 2 cases through these 4 theoretical lenses, one of which is school improvement, school effectiveness. One is governance theory, one's complexity theory, and one's actor network theory. And of course, when you then look at them through these different lenses, you kind of recognize different things about collaboration and the leadership of collaboration, but also how I think we swim in the water of school improvement, school effectiveness, where those of us who work in education, and in schooling tend to assume that these questions about efficiency and does it lead to learning gains and how do we measure it and what are we going to see, is it value for money, supporting these teacher networks when I could be doing their lesson planning for them, type questions, means that we fail to recognize some of the ways in which networks have other benefits, some of which you've articulated there on the slide. But if you take the complexity lens, for example, you talked about innovation and different perspectives. That comes from complexity theory, really, where there's this recognition that you need diverse perspectives on the issue. This is why we try and build teams that have, diverse, complementary, but different skill sets and so on, because that's how we generate new ideas. That's where innovation comes from, is this kind of different perspectives on the same set of issues is valuable. And it doesn't always spark in that way, of course, which is why it's very hard to measure the effectiveness of networks, because some are much more successful than others. But how we lead it, how we try and get that value without narrowing it, I think is a really important skill to think about.
Yeah. I mean, my big takeaway from that, and that's really, again, I use the word fascinating a lot during this, I suppose, but it is all very fascinating. That idea that it's not as simple as it looks. You can't just put people together and then wash your hands of it. It takes pre-thought and management, and the fact that you were able to write a book on it would even suggest that it's more complex than it first seems.
And one of the things that's often said about leading networks is that leading a school, leading in a positional role, I'm the head of CPD, I'm the head teacher, and therefore I have a level of hierarchical kind of authority and an ability to get things done, which once you're in a genuine network where it's a lateral network and you're not in positional authority, how you lead, I think, it is there's lots of overlaps, but there's also lots of differences, and being a good head doesn't necessarily make you a good trust chief execs, let's say, or a good network leader.
One of the things I usually joke about during these podcasts is the fact that the guests will say something that then sparks a potential launch pad for the next book, And tell me, is there such thing as lateral leadership?
There is.
Is there? Damn it! That would have been. I could have had that as my own thing. Right, well, that's going to be my next Google answer.
So I'd start with probably Huxham and Vangan, their work, and they talk about lateral leadership quite a lot, but others do as well.
Oh, great. Well, I'll put the links to. You'll send me the links, and I'll put them in the chat. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, that's super interesting, and so we've come really to the end of the podcast, but we've got one last Fast Friends question, which I'm fascinated about, and we talked offline that this is both. It could have been the most embarrassing. It could have been one of the most embarrassing moments at the same point. But the question you chose is, when did you last cry in front of another person? So tell us a bit about that.
So, I mean, as I get older, I find I cry in front of the television, several nights of the week. So, but I do that in private and not in front of other people. The last time I can remember crying in front of other people was my last day at the National College. So this would have been 2013. And as you've probably kind of gathered, I get quite invested in my work. I'm quite passionate about it. And, it was a time when, under the coalition government, it was very clear that the college was being dismantled, and all that good work, which I'd spent 7 years kind of, putting my heart and soul into, was being pulled apart. And at the kind of little gathering of, my team and other teams to say goodbye, I read out that quote from Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does.
Yeah.
And I kind of read that out, and then I just burst into tears. I think it was just, the emotion of it just got the better of me.
Yeah, and something to be celebrated, I suppose. Those endings and those things that make you cry have a negative kind of stance to them, but the fact that created such emotion in you shows, I guess, how much that work meant to you, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you have to be kind of grateful that you were ever even involved in that stuff.
Yeah, and we'd been through 2 mergers. We'd been a standalone agency, then we'd merged with what was then called the TDA, the Training and Development Agency, which did all of the initial teacher education stuff. Then we merged with the department, and we became an executive agency. And all of that, that I'd been through that over the 2 years or so prior to that, and all through which we tried to hold on to, what's special about the college. How do we try and keep the flame alight? And it, obviously, I do a lot of research, with multi-academy trusts, looking at kind of culture and organizational development and so on. And when we talk about schools joining and how difficult that can be, that emotion that we invest in our work and in the culture and context of our work. And then when we're, when it feels like a takeover, or when it feels like that work is being kind of undermined, it comes with a lot of emotion. And it's all, it's the heart of why culture eats strategy for breakfast and everything, all those truisms, I think do have a lot of power to them.
And that's an interesting place to finish, really, I suppose, for leaders to reflect on the fact that, not to ignore the emotional element of any change. And certainly if you are coming into a new role in a new school, not to underestimate the emotion linked to the effort and the time that has been put into things prior to you arriving. Tread carefully, I suppose, is that first bit. Well, this has been so exciting and such a nice way to sort of finish my day today, which is great. How can people connect with your work then, Toby?
So Google me, Toby at Nottingham. I have a profile page on the University of Nottingham site. There's a website for the Sustainable School Leadership Project, which is sustainableschoolleadership.uk. And then, just drop me. My email address is on the Nottingham site. So if anyone wants to follow up.
Amazing. And again, get that book on kind of leading educational networks if you're involved in that. Well, thanks ever so much. Thanks to everyone who's listening. If you're interested in any of the Launchpad stuff, I'll put the links in there as well. And I'll see you at the next one.